Hello everyone and welcome to our first critical conversation of this academic year. My name is Ailey and I'm Learning and Engagement Manager with the University Museums, and I'm delighted to be with you all today to have this critical conversation about intangible cultural heritage. We're in for a fascinating discussion. So this series of events started way back in 2020, in the mists of time, in the mists of lockdown, when we decided as a university museums that we would love to be able to put staff, students, community members, experts in dialogue with each other to discuss the critical issues that museums face. I was trying to think of the right word there. Issues. Let's go for issues. And this is where it's developed from, basically. So tonight we are kicking off the programme for our new exhibition, which is called Return to Mingley, with this conversation. And Return to Mingley is going to be a really interesting exhibition. Can't wait to let you all see it from next weekend. It is the story of the island of Mingley, which is off the west coast of Scotland, and we'll be speaking a lot about island life this evening. And 3 photographers over the course of 100 years visited the island of Mingley to basically see how the absence of humans had an impact on the landscape. And it throws up a lot of issues around where cultural heritage and environment are tied together, and the loss of things like intangible cultural heritage. So we will be getting stuck into that conversation this evening. So I would love, first of all, for our wonderful panelists to introduce themselves as part of this discussion, just so you know which fab people we have to speak this evening. So first on my screen, I have Karen. Karen, would you be willing to say hello to everybody?
Good evening, Ailey, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. My name is Karen Brown, and I'm Professor of Art History and Museum and Heritage Studies in the University of St Andrews. So I would say that I've been interested in ICH since I was a child, but in a professional capacity, mostly over the last decade, I've been working on coordinating international research projects in which intangible heritage plays a really key role. And we've been working with partners in Europe, but also especially in Latin America and the Caribbean. So that's an introduction to me.
Thank you so much, Karen. And can I come to Jasmine next?
Thanks, Hayley. Fesca Malgrave. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm Jasmine, and I'm the Development Officer for Comandolchas Ishigal, which is the Outer Hebrides Heritage Forum. We're a membership organisation with 25 members across the Western Isles, lobbying on behalf of and for the community heritage sector of the Western Isles.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. And last but not least, Meg.
Hi, good evening, and thank you so much, Ailey, for asking me to be a part of this. My name's Meg Hyland, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh in Celtic and Scottish Studies, and I did my undergrad at St Andrews in medieval history. And my research is about the role of music in the lives of women who worked as itinerant herring gutters in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so more broadly, I'm really interested in the role of oral history archives in intangible heritage, both in what they preserve and then what they can bring to the future.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure as everyone listening in will be able to tell, we have a really, really broad range of interests and expertise on the panel tonight, which will make for a fascinating discussion. So I think the first place I would love to start, and to give anybody who's tuning in who maybe doesn't know an introduction, is what do we mean by intangible cultural heritage? A good basis for the beginning of this discussion. And Karen, I wondered whether you might like to speak to this.
No problems. So, as it says, the name on the tin, intangible cultural heritage is heritage that is supposed to distinguish itself from tangible cultural heritage, heritage that you can touch, that maybe is an object. In many parts of the world, these differentiations aren't so clear. They could be one and the same thing. But the most official definition has come from UNESCO, who in 2003 developed a convention for the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage. And this, of course, was in response to a lot of traditions that were being lost around the world and that they wanted to officially protect and have governments invest in. So for their definition, they include oral traditions, traditional craft skills, performing arts, social practices, and then knowledges and practices concerning both nature and the universe. That's how they define intangible cultural heritage. And whenever it was the convention was made in 2003, it was widely supported, interestingly, I think, by countries from the global south, especially Latin America and the Caribbean, because what they felt at that time was that it would provide increased validation for their heritage and their worldviews. So it proved especially important at that point for Indigenous and Native populations living in areas of natural significance. The story is a little bit more complicated than that, so you can come back to me if you wish later on. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Karen, for that introduction. And I think, you know, the part about it providing increased validation for communities is so important. And I guess that really speaks to the work that you do, Jasmine, around supporting communities and advocating for communities. And I guess one of the things that maybe we can touch on is around how museums, archives and heritage organisations can help support communities to advocate for themselves and that sort of thing. So that's something we might want to come back to at this evening. And I think the other thing, Karen, that was in that definition that's really, really interesting is that idea of both nature and the universe. It's so tied to environment, to place, and how those things are all sort of tied up in cultural heritage, which is obviously really, really key in this story of the island of Mingulay. So I guess it might be an interesting place to start around a question of how intangible cultural heritage and environment are connected. So, you know, does the loss of one lead to another and that sort of thing? I wonder, Meg, I know that you have a lot of interest in place names, and this is something I guess that people might be able to immediately relate to around, yeah, intangible cultural heritage.
Yeah, lots of interesting points brought up there. With place names, it's interesting. There has been some research done on comparing, you know, places, especially thinking about Mingulay being in the Hebrides more broadly, places that are currently not permanently inhabited. Oftentimes in Scotland, these are islands where now they're nature sanctuaries. And it's interesting to compare kind of maps from, say, Scottish Natural Heritage, which might be highlighting geographic features, but kind of interest to the modern conservationist mindset. And these places can be described as wild, but actually when you look at Gaelic place name maps, you know, every little hill and stream might have a name, especially when you think about an island where it's quite a geographically constrained area that people would have been really intimately familiar with. And that doesn't mean they didn't leave. You know, there were places like Mingulay, people were going back and forth to other islands in other parts of the country, but when you look at the place names, they can have things like personal names, and there might be a story behind them. You know, things change. There were reasons people might have had to leave, but the idea of completely losing that sort of intangible heritage is something that I think as museum people, archive people, we kind of naturally don't want to let that disappear. And it also is meaningful to these communities to have that preserved, even if they can't be in the place anymore.
And Jasmine, I wonder, how does that speak to your experience of working in the Hebrides at the moment?
Yeah, it's as Meg was saying, you know, I think this point about the significance when you're touching on place names that are affiliated with personal connections, or, I mean, Gaelic is an extremely descriptive language. And I think as well, you know, we recognise too that people were not so well travelled as we are now, and you know, the focus of their world was their kind of intimate patch type thing, and that's potentially how these places become so rich in their kind of description. But I think as well, you know, we're touching on a lot of different kind of, there's a lot of different influences over, if we are touching on loss, to do with ICH and the kind of changes, you know, in the example we're talking about in Mingulay, obviously it's not a populated place now. It's obviously the National Trust that are managing it for environmental purposes. But I think too, we kind of can't, I mean, human beings are part of the environment too. We're not separate. We're all part of that. So I think, you know, when we talk about loss or change, I think it's kind of important that we recognise sort of that everything is in flux. In general, everything is in flux, and that places can change. And I think similarly too, we sort of recognise the connection that can still be sort of made by the immediate population, and also those that still feel the affinity. I suppose what I'm getting at here is that we're talking about a community that was evacuated from that island and moved into other places, whether through migration or indeed emigration. And I think, you know, nowadays we see the kind of diaspora as well connection to these communities. So it's a kind of change in how people relate to the place. But I'm not suggesting one's sort of right and the other's not. It's just it's a kind of different situation. Yeah, I suppose is what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, the point there that humans and the environment exist together, right? There isn't a sort of a real separation in many cases. So with Mingulay, you know, I guess the tendency might be to say, well, you know, humans left and it's become a bird sanctuary and nature has kind of reclaimed the land, and it's, you know, that's fantastic. But like you say, there's kind of a tie there where, although that has grown and developed, there is a loss there in terms of the human relationship to that island. So I think that's a really interesting point. I wonder, Karen, are there any sort of similarities when Meg and Jasmine are talking to your experience with Latin America, just out of interest?
Sure. I'm just thinking on what you were saying. There was a book recommended to me by a colleague in sustainable development, Althea Davies, called Rumbunctious Gardens, which you might quite like, because it deals with that idea of change and migration and human patterns changing the landscape, but also ways in which nature and environment can kind of take over. And it isn't always about rewilding and trying to go back to the way things were, but sometimes, you know, nature can deal with things in quite a meaningful way. So it's maybe worth a look. I mean, I think when it comes to intangible cultural heritage, most of my experience has been, yes, from the Scottish Western Isles, but also from Central America. And so we've worked for many years with Indigenous communities in Costa Rica, and probably one of the most profound experiences there was simply going on a walk around the village with one of the village elders, explaining to a group of young people, with myself and Jamie Brown, who leads the youth exchanges, about every single plant that he walked past and its properties. And it was completely eye-opening for me, because the whole place just came alive, you know, in many ways, and in many colours and smells and understanding of this environment that was so important to them. And of course, it was something that we weren't allowed to record or share in any shape or form because it was private Indigenous knowledge. But that was a real privilege and a real eye-opener to understanding just how close a native people can be to the environment around them. So yeah, thanks for the question.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely, it must be fascinating to see something come to life in a way that yeah, with the naked eye you wouldn't necessarily think, but there's such a deep relationship between the community who lives somewhere and the land that they live on. And I guess speaking to communities and their role and their power in this process of the preservation of intangible cultural heritage, I guess I wonder whether we'd like to speak to the idea of how we ensure as heritage professionals, for the most part, how we ensure that communities and the needs of the communities are at the heart of the preservation of ICH and not the organisation first, if that makes sense. I wonder if anybody would like to speak to that as a topic. Meg? Fantastic.
Yeah, so I think that is such a big topic, and I suspect we'll all have a lot to say about it. But so thinking back to Mingulay, so I'm a student at the University of Edinburgh, and at the School of Scottish Studies, we've got an oral history archive that goes back to, I think the earliest recordings are from like 1949, but it really got properly started in the early 50s. And the most prolific contributor to the school's song collection was a woman called Nan McKinnon, and she was from Battersea, but her mother was from Mingulay. And I think this is a really interesting example. So Nan learned most of her songs from her mother, and she had memorized the words to over something like 400 songs. And that was all, I mean, she was literate, but that was mostly, learned from oral history. And so even though she herself had not lived in Mingulay, this cultural heritage from this island continued on, and then she ended up living in Barra rather than Battersea. And so it's like what Jasmine was mentioning about the diaspora communities is a really big part of this. So getting back to your original question, Nan was a very enthusiastic contributor to the archive. And so I think it's an interesting example of a case where when the archive was founded, the communities were deeply involved. And, she was interviewed by many different field workers, and she was very enthusiastic about sharing her knowledge and getting it recorded. Now, that was a while ago now, 1951 was 72 years ago. So I still date everything by 2000, and then I just add 20 years. But, access has been definitely challenged to the archive with the pandemic. There are pluses and minuses in how communities can access it. In-person access has been really restricted, and the archive's only open by appointment right now 1 day a week, which makes it more challenging if someone was coming and happened to be in Edinburgh and wanted to listen to some of the material that, say, maybe their grandfather from Mingulay had recorded. I mean, there's thousands of entries about Mingulay from elderly people who were interviewed who had grown up there. But then on the other hand, there's been a huge digitization effort. And on Topar and Dulcish, or the Kista Riches, as long as you have an internet connection, no matter where in the diaspora you are, if you're a descendant of the Mingulay community, you can access hundreds of recordings. And so I think there are definitely, as archives age, a lot of effort gets put into trying to update them so that they become more accessible. But on the other hand, there are challenges like COVID and, keeping the building ventilated, and rising costs in the education sector, things like this, which can pose challenges to physical access for the communities.
Yeah, go ahead, Jasmine.
No, it was just to kind of expand on that. I think when we are talking about maintaining access, yes, obviously Meg's describing some physical barriers that we are facing, but I think in terms of responding to these challenges, we all recognise that the sectors that we work in or we study in there's capacity issue. There's kind of at the core of this, but I think the way we I suppose get round is through kind of education, I would say, and through partnership working. I think we really need to be working more effectively together. And when I say that, I am meaning kind of national institutions, I am meaning academia, and I am meaning sort of on the ground bodies. And I think as well, when we're talking about like the centrality of ICH to the community, I mean, arguably, the focus of local historical societies, community-led heritage here, it's right at the crux. ICH is right at the crux of it. It's what is actually stimulating quite a lot of these things. In this instance, I'm thinking about kind of NES Historical Society, Community Niche, and I suppose I'm thinking of them because they're the first example of this kind of preservation society for local history, and as part of that ICH, I think that's kind of why they're coming to mind. But the basis of that kind of organisation was a thesis where someone went out and gathered local knowledge. And from that today, you have a purpose-built facility that has year-round employment, has a bustling cafe for tour buses, etc., who want to come in and access their accredited museum and their local archive. So I suppose just what I'm saying is that, investment in ICH can render like very significant benefit. And I know we shouldn't only be thinking through the lens of economic development, but I am a development officer, so I kind of have to think about that. But I suppose it's just the putting the value of this at the centre and working collaboratively can render good results for preservation of ICH overall.
Thanks so much for that, Jasmine. Yeah, I think, the bottom line is that, well, certainly from my perspective, when heritage organisations work in partnership with communities, it usually leads to better results for both. That is without a doubt. And I think that there is something there about the issue of collections more generally, right? So as heritage organisations, we have collections. Often that is, why we exist. That's our purpose, to be custodians for collections. I wonder whether there's something to be said about the difference of a collection being held centrally, so by a national institution, so whether that's a national library or an archive or whatever it might be, and collections that are held within communities. So, I mean, Meg, you kind of touched on that a little bit in terms of access and physical access to collections, but I wonder whether anybody would like to speak to the idea of whether they should be, national bodies or within communities, or are both sort of good for different things.
I can say something if you want.
Yeah, you go, Karen.
I mean, just as you're speaking, what comes to mind is not so long ago, I was out in Grimsey and interviewed the local boat builder there, and he mentioned in passing that the Silver Seas, one of the Grimsey boats that they'd made, they had donated it to Anstruther Fisheries Museum, but then borrowed it back, which is quite clever, because the National Fisheries Museum is responsible for the maintenance and the care of the boat, but they get to have it back in the community. So, I mean, for me, it's always, it's, you know, the ideal is to have these things back in the community, because I think when I was listening to the conversation there, of course, I think that the ethical preservation of ICH is one of the most important core functions of museums and archives and their service to society and to the different communities. But we also have to think about the transmission of the ICH. So they're two different things, you know. And I won't tell you which island I was on recently, but the curator said had dedicated their lives to preserving a lot of oral traditions in particular, and a lot of them are uploaded to Kista Riches, which is a fabulous resource from the School of Scottish Studies. But the visit kind of inspired them to think about the why. Why have I done this? Is it just for some locals and a lot of diasporic tourists to come and see? Or, you know, he he actually said, so you're a pathologist, because he was saying that I was actually studying why that centre was dying, which I thought was really sad, you know. So we brainstormed a little bit and thought about ways in which essentially you could engage youth. And I think that that's something that really needs to be discussed in this forum, is the intergenerational transmission of ICH. I'm sure everybody's got something to say about that.
I think pass over to Jasmine to follow up on what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, especially in a place where we're facing an aging population, and you've probably seen the census results that were published. So the Western Isles is seeing the most significant kind of depopulation. So the transmission to, as Karen's saying, the transmission to our young people is key, because as we know, they're the custodians for the future. So again, I would say this comes into partnership working and education, because, you know, academics or national institutions have the skills that potentially the knowledge bearers don't, in terms of preservation and widening access to preserved records, you know, if that's recordings of whatever, stories. So again, I would say I think that's kind of the role that I see how the two work together in order to preserve that. I think just slightly rewinding a wee bit as well, when we're talking about collections and interpretation of collections, I think it is important to recognise that, you know, yes, you know, we're talking about museums here widely, but the collecting policies and remits are different, you know, and I think we need to recognise that what a national institution or a university museum is doing is it's not going to have the same focus as a local historical. You're not going to get that kind of depth of I suppose of ICH or associated knowledge that somebody within the community who might be working in the museum would have. But of course, that's kind of part of why people need to come in and see these places and see these objects in their context. But I mean, an example I'm just kind of had been thinking about was that Kildonan Museum, which is in South Uist, has Flora MacDonald's glass rolling pin on display, and a national institution was interested, I believe it's the National Museum of Scotland, but they were interested in this object because it was a fine example of Venetian 18th century glass. They were interested in it from that side of the lens, but on the other side of the lens, the people on the ground here were more interested because obviously of the significance of Flora MacDonald to, you know, she was born in South Uist, the connection she has to this part of the world. So it's in Kildonan, that's where it is now. But I recognise that, you know, I recognise kind of the limitations of both, or the potential of both, I suppose, is just what I'm saying, and how we interpret as a result of that. So it's just something I felt I wanted to comment on. Just
Absolutely, and I think there are a lot of things to be said around yeah, what knowledge is prioritized, right, in the recording of knowledge of intangible cultural heritage. So, you know, we had as part of our Recollecting Empire exhibition, the wonderful Anindya Ray Chowdhury from the School of English in St Andrews spoke to how there was a specimen, a fish specimen in our natural history collections that you know, it was just recorded in the university archives as the kind of fish it was. You know, it was a scientific object in that respect. But he was, you know, he told us a whole story about how it's totally connected to the Bay of Bengal and his life there. So it's a really interesting point of discussion. Meg, I think you maybe had something to come in on there.
Yeah, it was really interesting. This ties to what Karen and Jasmine were saying, that Karen mentioned the Fisheries Museum in Anstruther, because I first got interested in this whole topic by volunteering there. And it's an interesting example in this discussion of a national versus a local museum, because it started as a local museum. But as some of the curators have described it to me, they had the foresight to just call it the Scottish Fisheries Museum instead of the East Nuke or the Fife Fisheries Museum. And so as the museum has grown over the decades, they've tried to, you know, accommodate the national fishing story in Scotland and beyond, like Karen was talking about, taking responsibility for objects from far afield, but at the same time, it still has a very local focus. Like, for example, I remember helping out set up an exhibition that was curated about the streets of Cellardike, from the skipper of the Reaper, and he had grown up. The Reaper is the museum's heritage boat, and we had set it up. You know, he had given us the general outline, but then he asked us, we had to entirely reorient it because we had designed it to be walked around counterclockwise. And he said, you would never take a ship out of harbor counterclockwise, so it has to be clockwise if you want this exhibit to succeed. So it's like, it's a museum that's still very rooted in local fishing communities, even as they, you know, a lot changes about them. They're less focal for the community, the fishing industry, while also trying, and I think often succeeding, but to be a national museum. But that does bring other issues. Like, for example, there's very little Gaelic in the museum. And that's something that, as a Gaelic learner, I've been interested in trying to come up with ways to get it more on display and get Gaelic songs playing sometimes. But it kind of, I think it's a good example of a museum that it didn't exactly set out to become a national museum. It started as a local history thing, but it clearly kind of filled a need that it was realized it could tell a story that was larger than the local community while still being very rooted in it. But you know, other museums are much different, like the National Museum in Edinburgh. And I thought Jasmine's example of the Flora MacDonald piece as a tangible cultural heritage was really interesting, because it is tangible, but the most important thing about it to the people in Kildonan, like you said, was the intangible. So yeah.
I might have one other thing to add. I think, Karen, you had touched on this earlier too, you know, that the tangible and the intangible, they are separate, but obviously they are intertwined. And a kind of example of something interesting that's happening on the ground too is that we've got a PhD student who's looking at Gaelic material culture with Salna Rostig and National Museum of Scotland. It's a partnership. So again, you know, and I kind of, well, out of interest, but also because I'm a bit nosy, I was sort of wondering, you know, where are you going with this? Because I'm interested to know. And, you know, I was sort of presenting it more in the case of the two being separate, but, you know, he was saying, well, really, you know, to my mind, it's kind of an interwoven thing. So it's just, again, it is just an example of things that can be done collaboratively to kind of expand on this. And I think, you know, because as we were saying as well, you know, there's a lot of national recognition now with ICH, you know, Historic Environment Scotland, who traditionally have been in the tangible or property-based, Museums Galleries Scotland. There's a lot of kind of place-based, intangible cultural heritage kind of preservation. So, yeah, it's just I do feel there potentially, you know, as you said, Karen, this is a 2003 definition of ICH, but I feel there is kind of shift in how we perceive all this. So it's interesting. It's an interesting time to be working on it too.
Absolutely. Karen?
Well, I think just providing a little bit more context to what Jasmine's just said, because this is an interesting thing, is Scotland's relationship with ICH. We have Fiona Hislop, who is pro-ICH and actually pro-ratification of ICH at a governmental level. But at the same time, the UK of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is not a state party to the UNESCO Convention of ICH, and so one can ask why that is. And while there's quite a bit of sympathy being shown, as Jasmine's pointed out, especially in recent years in Scotland, it remains a hard and fast thing that the UK hasn't joined this convention, along with a number of other countries. And I think it is because of the priority given to the built heritage and archaeology, essentially. You've got really big, strong organisations like Historic England that are needing all the money that they can, you know, that they can muster. So I think essentially this isn't a good business model for the British government. They don't see that they'll get a return for this investment in what is called intangible cultural heritage, because it comes with a cost to be designated as such, and that I think is the main barrier on that kind of higher level. But I'm not saying that UNESCO as a nation is everything that we need. It absolutely isn't, because it's really apparent in this discussion how much is going on. You don't actually really need it for things to get done, but it's very important to some countries to get that government funding and support and recognition at the same time.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think, you know, in my mind, the sort of barrier there has also been, you know, what museums and archives and heritage organisations, like you say, have prioritised in the past, and maybe at one stage there wasn't that sort of same value placed on ICH, and like I say, with that fish specimen, for example, it was just a fish, right? So I think the point though about funding is it's critical, isn't it? It's what stops us doing all the things we would love to do all the time. We have limited resource often, and it sounds as though the real hope there, without having that sort of that legal framework, is, like you say, the grassroots stuff that's going on. So I wonder, Karen, if could you tell us a little bit more about the youth exchange, because I think that's clearly something there that can speak to this.
Yes, I'd love to. And the absent friend here is a young man called Jamie Brown, who's well known to myself. He's worked with both myself and Jasmine for a lot of years. And he has led these youth exchanges. But essentially in every project that we've run from the School of Art History over the past decade, there has been this aspect of intergenerational transmission of knowledge. And this has been in Scotland, Portugal, Spain, Costa Rica, Chile, Peru, Barbados. And within that then, the heaviest investment has been on transnational youth exchanges. So in the first project, EULAC Museums, it was between Scotland and Costa Rica and Portugal as well. So that was Skye and the Indigenous community that I described earlier. And most recently then, it's between the Isle of Harris and Barbados. And Sarah Collar, our Museum and Heritage Studies student, has been an intern on that and incredibly helpful in that youth exchange. But essentially, one of the tasks that these young people are given is to go around recording village elders or their grandparents telling stories that they think should be preserved. It's a really simple task. It can be as simple as 3 questions. It can be done on your mobile phone. But at the same time, It also increases the young person's sense of place, their sense of belonging, and in the context of then an international exchange, it also allows them to showcase their stories from their place, to increase those senses even more with peers across the Atlantic in this case. So this increases not only their sense of place, but also their self-confidence and then their role in local heritage. And some of the young people who've been engaged in these exchanges have gone on to really work locally for their communities, especially in Skye, so far as Jasmine will know. There are several young people there who are getting more and more involved in their local heritage committee. And that's really what you want, even if it's only one or two, it makes it all worthwhile.
It just sounds like such a brilliant format for that exchange of knowledge, and I guess it's that bit about sort of empowering people to take that, I don't know, that pride in their own heritage, because unless you have that conversation with your grandparent or whatever it might be, that story might go untold. So it's a brilliant idea. I wonder, Meg, in terms of the archives that you root through, do you see any sort of intergenerational stuff there? Are there any sort of grandparents and grandchildren chatting to each other? And because I think that's such a big part of it, isn't it? It's if I think about myself, the one thing that always comes up when I think about intangible cultural heritage and that intergenerational thing, it's dialect, right? So there are certain phrases. The way I like to think about it is there are certain phrases that my like granny will use, that my mum will know what they mean but won't use them, and then I won't know what they are at all. So it's like, where's that sort of missing? Like, I just wonder if there's any sort of visibility of that intergenerational thing in the archive.
That's a really good question. And I think that pattern you describe with your grandmother and your mother, so many people experience that. I mean, I think about my grandmother's, neither of their parents spoke English very well. And so it's like when you think about those things, they're like, oh, I've heard that said, but I don't know what it means. But thinking about the archives, yeah, it's interesting. So in addition to working with existing archival material, I've done a few ethnographic recordings of my own, and the experience that comes to mind when you're asking about this was I was in Shetland 2 summers ago, and in Shetland there are still women who did the work as herring gutters in the 60s and early 70s before it all changed to factories. And there was one woman I was speaking with, Rita McNabb, and her son and granddaughter were in the conversation at the same time, and that wasn't really planned. Her husband wasn't well, and so there were family members coming in and out to see him, but a lot of them would stop and hear that I was talking to Rita about just what life had been like, and like her son had been the last cooper trained in the traditional ways in Shetland. For those listeners who don't know, the coopers make the barrels. And, it was really interesting listening to their back and forth. Rita explaining how things had been for her children when she was like trying to be a mother while working. And then they'd be saying like, oh no, Mom, like it was like this. Or, the different generations would focus on different aspects. And, there's other things there, not just generation, like gender and stuff. For example, like her son told some pretty funny stories about fights that some of the fishermen had gotten into and how the priest had to step in. They were Irish fishermen. And, that's not a story Rita had told. But then on the other hand, Rita had this longer perspective than he did because he had been growing up as it was kind of the traditional way of doing the fishing work was ending. Whereas she had done the hand gutting for a long time before the machines came in. And so I think that in archival recordings, sometimes you get that as well. It's not always labeled. Sometimes you'll hear voices chiming in that sound younger, but you're not sure who they are. So it can depend on the notes. But, one of the best contributors on my research topic was a woman from Barra who didn't have any children, but her niece who had done the herring gutting work like a generation after her, was interviewed with her at her I think it was her 70th or 80th birthday party that the field workers went to in the 70s. And so it's like having, when we think of these kind of recordings, we think of the interviewer sitting there and then the informant sitting there. But actually, the more people you can involve, and like you said, across these generational gaps, you get the different perspectives and people commenting and reminding each other of things. And I remember when Rita's son Jim walked in, he was saying, "Oh, Ma, I'm always telling you got to write this stuff down," and that was like encouragement, and for her and for me, obviously, but I was not the target. And so, I think we don't always think of that with the recordings. And sometimes when you just get these snippet archival recordings, you just hear like someone monologuing because they had very limited recording. If they're going on wax cylinders or something, they've done a lot of that discussion before they started the recording. So that is one advantage of modern recording technologies, that you can kind of get people chatting a little bit more and feeling a little less self-conscious, especially, when you think about the old days when they had to have the giant recording device, whereas now you can just kind of set your phone down on the table. So I think that does affect it.
Yeah, it's all about the story, right? And like you say, how the story moves through different people and different generations and different communities. And it's just so fabulous to hear little sort of anecdotes like that. I wonder, we're coming to the end of our time together this evening, and as you can imagine, we've only just scratched the surface, I think. I wonder, Jasmine, as a kind of end note, I wonder if you want to maybe speak a little bit to the kinds of work that's going on in the Hebrides at the moment, and where our hope for the future and the next generation of people who want to take this forward lie.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sure all our members would be pleased to have a little bit of platform about what they've been up to, so thanks for that. But no, I think obviously, as Karen mentioned, we've got a transnational youth exchange happening through the island communities, which is not insignificant. So that's something that's happening. But similarly, I think, to do with this dissemination of knowledge, this year is centenary of the Metagama and the Marawach, which were immigrant vessels that took people from Lewis and departing South Uist. So this year we've kind of been doing a lot of activity affiliated with that, and there's been a really wonderful response to that. We've had the local authority education department in doing school productions, working with the Kominyachtri, who are the local historical societies, to develop the scripts. So that's an example of sharing these kinds of stories. We've had exhibitions, we've had talks, we've had monuments, we've had loads of stuff right through the island chain. And Bara, I would mention too, actually traced, I think, 50 descendants from the Marloch, and brought them over to Bara for a homecoming week, which was, Kayleys and watching Whiskey Galore and all this kind of stuff. So it's I think, again, I would highlight as well, this is not just about, we're reaching into communities that are able to trace their roots. We're reaching out into the diaspora. We're reaching out into those with affinity. So that's tapping into communities that we might not have reached before. And I think too, as well, I would stress the kind of value of that kind of stuff more widely, to the economy as well. So there is a lot of really exciting on the ground stuff happening affiliated with these groups that are working to preserve local heritage and, by extension, ICH. So come and visit us, because there's lots of things to come and see. But yeah, it's it's remarkable the outreach that ICH can have, I suppose, is my closing point. So.
What a fun time it sounds like you can have on the Hebrides. I think we should all go and visit. That sounds like an action point for everyone off the back of this conversation. Thank you so much, everybody, for taking part in this panel. It's been an absolute joy to hear your perspectives. And yeah, thank you for sharing all of that expertise. And it sounds as though with all of these youth exchanges and this research and this development work, we've got a lot to be hopeful for, in that ICH will be carried into the next generation. And as heritage folk, we have a real duty to make sure that that happens in a way that's beneficial to our communities. So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in this evening, and please do tune in again next month when we'll be talking all about the poet Phyllis Wheatley and what that means for museum collections and diversifying them. So keep tuned in on our socials to find out when that's happening. So thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.